Energy storage is really important for our nation's renewable energy goals because as we're bringing on so much solar and wind and other RNG, biomass type renewable energy resources, hydro, et cetera, there's got to be a way to balance when that energy is being produced and when it can be used. And we've just seen a really plethora of interest in using energy storage as that resource to allow us to integrate more renewable energy. In particular, in New York City, where they have a requirement to basically provide 80% of their peak load within the 5 boroughs. Energy storage is a great tool for us to really integrate more renewables and allow for the phasing out of really one of these kind of polluting old peaker plants that are the backbone of New York City's power. Really, energy storage is going to become really a workhorse that has to be connected to solar, wind, and other renewable energy resources as a way to really maximize the use of renewable energy while minimizing and creating a more efficient power grid. And what we're starting to see in the industry was what used to be kind of two kind of clear, distinct sectors, utility scale storage, standalone, and I consider that to be 50 megawatts or above. And most of these projects we're using lithium ion batteries that have a 4-hour runtime. So if you say a 50 megawatt battery, typically what we mean in the industry is 200 megawatts worth of power that is comes on seamlessly by the grid when it's really needed for managing peak loads. And what we're seeing is sort of this interesting partnering opportunities that's appearing because I'm working with a lot of big, large corporations, technology giants, campuses and whatnot that have really fairly high energy loads as it relates to commercial industrial, so 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts. And they have perfect locations for us to co-join or co-locate standalone energy storage for the grid at large. And yet when you can combine those two projects, you can really create a lot of economies of scale that shed back into that C&I space to create lower costs energy-wise. So energy as a service, as a microgrid, really ties well into these energy storage projects. Really, I think everybody knows that President Biden is really getting ready to invest $1.7 trillion in infrastructure. And you really can't mention infrastructure investment in his team without talking about resiliency. When President Biden talks about infrastructure, the checkpoint is going to be climate change and resiliency. So any investments that they're doing in transportation and highways and smart cities and EV charging networks, basically everything really is with an eye towards resiliency. And that goes all the way down into these ecosystems that I'm working in, whether that's New York City or working with large manufacturing facilities upstate, both in California as well as in New York State. So you, again, have these sort of hybrid models where we're working with large corporations, helping them to get their arms around what their footprint needs are, making sure that they have redundancy and resiliency in their power supply. So if the grid at large goes down, they have backup power that comes on immediately, seamlessly, can't even tell. And yet at the same time, I have the benefit of using a portion of property that maybe they weren't using for me to generate a lot more power to the grid. So it's really a win-win. So from a standpoint of questions that you're asking me, it's really a way for us to blend and to create revenue streams that are separate from their rate base, let's say, that just really is levering unused property. Most landfills, most wastewater treatment plants, most really large industrial complexes have 2 to 3 megawatts of property 2 to 3 acres of property that I can put on almost 100 megawatts of energy storage and access the grid because all of those assets are already in place. And in some cases are stranded. So really you're levering unused property to generate new income resources for that entity that owns the property. So that's become really an interesting partnering opportunity that I'm levering with most of my friends that are in that wastewater treatment plant business, typically municipalities and or large private companies. We've talked to all of the really large waste companies about co-locating energy storage at their landfills, and these make a lot of sense, in particular if they have landfill gas in place, because landfill gas to electricity was traditionally what most landfills and wastewater treatment plants used. But pivoting that biogas to RNG uses like vehicle fuel is a higher value. And yet, so really what you can do is go in, allow them to pivot in either vehicle fuel or direct inject to the natural gas pipeline. And then I can pick up that excess capacity at the interconnect. So really now they're creating two income streams where there used to be one. Well, I think most of my very large technology clients are really looking at how they can create more charging infrastructure at some of these campuses where they have a lot of employees. And those are going to be for, passenger vehicles. So I see, in the EV space, a lot of electrification around passenger vehicles. Where we're really seeing the RNG make a lot of sense is in areas with heavy duty trucks or medium-sized trucks. Although the medium-sized trucks, we're seeing more and more products coming out in the market that these companies really like and that work very well. In the past, RNG in these major, larger vehicles, larger trucks and medium-sized trucks, they weren't performing as well as diesel did. But now we're starting to see that gap kind of change. But for the large trucks, for example, at a waste landfill where they're creating biogas, and that those trucks make a round trip to that landfill every day where they can then charge up or refuel using that biogas. That makes a lot of sense. And in particular, so for big fleets that use heavy duty trucks, where they have a set route and that route can be sized to allow them to use biogas, that's really a very efficient use. And that's probably why Waste Management probably has one of the largest RNG fleets in the country, because it makes so much sense for them to do that. So I'm really looking for corporations and partners, municipal partners, other types of partners, that may have large facilities if they're looking at their energy footprint, but that they also may have opportunistic locations where the grid is for us to look at co-locating energy storage. The benefits, I'm showing two very large sites because it gives you an idea of how big these campuses are and typically how easy it is for me to find 2 to 3 acres of land on these property sites. And again, I think I talked about some of the benefits to partnering and why these partnerships are becoming so important as a go-to opportunity to create a pathway for these organizations to get more resilient. In fact, what's happening also with a lot of the wastewater and landfills, in particular in urban locations, is that the management teams want to create a resilient energy campus. And typically the cities that surround these facilities are their rate base that's paying for this service. So for them to be able to create energy on these campuses that are typically industrial really helps them to solidify their long-term role and be seen as, a real player in the energy future for these communities that are trying to go green. So if you're sitting in your chair and you're listening to my spiel and you think this sounds interesting, some of the things that we look for really is interconnect capacity, or locations that provide that substation or interconnect opportunity. And like I said, most of these facilities have that. And then typically how they work, just if people don't know how energy storage works, it's really we basically put together these very large container farms. And each container typically has, like I told you, between 4 and 5 megawatts. Obviously, we build those to meet all the codes and the standards. And then those basically operate remotely. We operate those using connections to the grid. We get a message from the grid that they need that power, and that energy can be deployed within a nanosecond to the grid, a lot different than the peaker plants. I did add a little bit about biogas to this. We are seeing a lot of synergies co-locating energy storage, like I said earlier, with landfill gas to electricity operations, as well as wastewater treatment plant. And I think I talked a little bit about what are some of these drivers and how you can pivot some of these large RNG biogas generators to use that in a higher value end use, and then still be able to utilize, what would become then a stranded capacity or stranded asset in the form of interconnect capacity. Well, I have this, I gave you a slide. I don't know if everybody can see the dolphins in that wave. I thought that was such a great nature shot because I'm a surfer, and so that was fun for me. Unfortunately, I wasn't surfing that way, but I have been out there when they've been there. But this is some contact information. Typically, most of our projects that we're doing are in the 100 million plus range for utility scale storage. So I'd be looking for large facilities, and typically I'm really focused on California and New York, although I am looking more in the Massachusetts market and some of the other markets that are starting to show a lot more industry-wide regulatory support to bring energy storage in as a component. So, really looking at your campus, figuring out if you have the space, do you have substations close by, are you close to congested zones? That's kind of a sweet spot for me. But if folks just want to give me a call and talk to me in general about it, I'm happy to. More and more, we're being pulled into the microgrid space. There's a lot of good companies in that space, but we're seeing sort of this synergy between co-locating microgrids with some of these big energy assets in these markets. So if you're close to New York City, or you're close to LA, San Francisco, San Diego, and you have an industrial located site, I'm always interested in talking to you about that. In particular, if you're in a planning process where you're looking at, what's the matrix or what's the mix of energy that you can use. It's, for a lot of these urban areas, it's very hard to co-locate solar generation with those, because again, another factoid point people can use is it takes about 5 acres to generate 1 megawatt of solar power. So you can tell the difference in why energy storage is getting so popular, because on a 5-acre site, as opposed to 1 megawatt of renewable energy, I can site and locate, a fairly large battery array, probably 200 to 300 megawatts of batteries at that location.
I think that's what's really great about your background and working with someone like you, is your background in waste, energy, finance, understanding, working with policymakers. It's really unique because it takes a lot of skill sets to do that. And I really appreciate your valuable time